Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about deductive reasoning. We talked about inductive reasoning on our first section, which is just looking at a pattern and, oh, it seems to be true. This should be next. Doesn't mean it has to be true. Deductive reasoning is something that has to be deduced to be true. It has to be reasoned or drawn to be a valid conclusion by applying a few different rules or definitions or something that will prove that that's true no matter what. So the essential question is, how can I use this deductive reasoning to draw valid conclusions? By applying something called the Law of Detachment, the Law of Syllogism, and the truth of a contrapositive. We've already mentioned this. So we're going to be doing that. So let's write down these three rules, which they're already drawn for you and written down. Again, highlight those in your definition, keywords, formulas, rules. Those are kind of key things. The truth of the contrapositive is something that will be always the same as the original statement. So a contrapositive is always logically, equivalent to the original statement. So if my original if then, like this, if it rains, then the ground is wet. So, when it's raining out, it does get wet. So then the converse, which is not this part and not this part. So if the ground is not wet, then it is not raining. So it's a logical conclusion that if this one's true, this one's also true. Or if this one's false, this one also has to be false. So that is something that we use called the truth of the contrapositive. Now we could use laws of deduction to say that's the same thing as if we have the converse and the inverse. Those also have to be equivalent to each other. Sorry, hard to speak sometimes. That is something you could also use, but that is not a rule we're going to use because the rule of truth of a contrapositive is what we're going to be focusing on. So the next rule is that the law of detachment. It says if we have if P then Q is true. So if we know something is true, the if then statement is true, then if the hypothesis happens to occur or is true, then Q must also be true. It's very simplistic in its thought process. So given that we know if a student studies, then they will pass the test. So let's say you study, then if everybody studies, then they have to pass the test. That's something that's going to be true. So let's just say, fact, the student studies, well, we just will say the conclusion. It has to happen. We know that this is a true statement. Therefore, if you do in fact study, then you should be passing the test. So that's what the law of detachment is. It's basically a common sense statement. It's basically saying we know this to be true, so why don't you study? Therefore, what has to happen is you pass the test. That is the law of detachment, or rule 2 in our case. Rule 3 we're going to call the law of syllogism. This is kind of like the transitive property, if you remember that from last year. So if it's like if A equals B, B equals C, then we can just jump to A equals C. So the idea is we learn this transitive property of equality. Basically, this is very similar in concept. So if A is B, B is C, well, the B's basically go away. We can just say A is C because we have those equal statements. The law of syllogism says that's true. So if P, then Q is true. And if Q, then R is true. Then we can just jump from P is true, then R is true. So we're just jumping from those. So if I just highlight this in a certain way, so P, if P, then Q, then we have R. Therefore, we can just jump to if P, then R. So if you think of highlighting, these two middle parts are identical. They match each other. So then we're just jumping from the first to the end. So a couple statements that you're going to be given. So just a quick example. If it is raining, then the ground is wet. If the ground is wet, then the grass will grow. So notice how those are identical like we highlighted before. The ground is wet. The ground is wet. We have this. We have this. So therefore, we can jump to a logical conclusion of this, then this. That if it's raining, that the grass will grow. That's rule 3, or that law of syllogism. It's chaining together logical statements, very similar to what we did here, like the transitive property of equality. this is all we're doing today, is just kind of identifying the rule and stating which statement is also true, like a logical conclusion to this. So above the statements, make sure you're watching those. So the first thing is, this is a true statement. If I liked the poem, then Jane prefers black to red. So let's identify what would be a true statement. So because we just are given a conditional statement and nothing else, we're just going to say that we can always use that, since the conditional statement is true, we can always say rule 1 or that truth of a contrapositive. So if we know the original statement is always true, then we can always flip it around. So we can basically say, if we're going to say the opposite of this, if Jane doesn't prefer black to red, then what we're going to say is she doesn't like the poem. Then she doesn't like the poem. So that's just the truth of contrapositive. Again, if we flip these around and negate them, that will always be true if that first statement is true. Or if that first statement was false, that will always be false. Remember, those always have to be a pair together. Okay, so this next one says, if the wall has been painted, then our instructor hates to fly. Interesting statement. That's true, apparently. So now, if our instructor hates to fly, then Gina is calling a timeout, which again doesn't make sense, but we're just going to say it's logically true. It's just kind of fun. So in this case, again, we have this first thing. We have this middle thing. Hey, that middle thing actually matches that middle thing. Therefore, we have this. So we're basically going the blue part. So if, oops, sorry, I got to write in actually a writing tool. So if the wall has been painted, then Gina is calling a timeout. Now, this was that law of syllogism, which references Rule 3, that law of syllogism, which is kind of like we're basically stringing or chaining those events together. We're basically, well, it has this, and we kind of delete those to jump from the blue part to the green part. The last one is saying, well, we have this true statement that Pablo heard the radio, then I'm in my first period class. So if Pablo hears the radio, then I'm in my first period class. That's a true statement. So what happens if Pablo heard the radio? What can you say? Well, you're just going to say that I am in my first period class. So literally, you just state that, is say that I am in my first period class. It's literally a logical, very basic, obvious thing. So basically, we say the statement, this is something that always has to be true in our situation. Therefore, if by chance Pablo heard the radio, well, then we can make that logical conclusion that that has to happen, which is that law of detachment, which is Rule 2. So these are a little bit tricky if you don't practice them, which I'm giving you plenty of time to practice them and try them over and over again on your assignment. So let's do one more example together, then I want you to try one. So first off, we're given if the river is overflowing, then it is Heather's favorite joke. Well, the river isn't flowing, so that indeed says that it's Heather's favorite joke. So we're just going to say that is Heather's favorite joke right there. That's all we're going to write that. And this, again, was that law of detachment, which is Rule 2. So Rule 2, if you go back, is that law of detachment. So then we're looking at the next one. So if the wall has been painted, then our instructor hates to fly. If our instructor hates to fly, then Kevin is calling a timeout, which I think we already talked about this one. And in fact, we did. I am sorry for duplicating that. What we're going to do is just, again, this is that first rule where we're going to take, or sorry, that's Rule 3. That's Rule 3, that law of syllogism, which is you take this part, we're going to do if that part, and then we're going to say that part. We're basically canceling out those two things. So if the middles of the true statements, if the middle or the ending of the first statement is the same as the beginning of that second statement, then it's a logical chain where it jumps from beginning to end. So we're just going to write that down. And then the last one will be that rule 1, which is that rule of contrapositive. So it's just telling us one true statement, nothing else. So if the play is a success, then Joe likes the milkshake. So basically we're going to say that if Joe does not like the milkshake, then the play was not a success. That would be that rule 1 or that contrapositive idea. So please write that down. I'm not going to, but you have the ability to do that yourself. So go ahead and try this next one. I'll identify the rules, and then I'm hoping you can try them out. And if you need help, let me know. I'd love to work with you one-on-one if you need that. So if you did try, this one's that rule of contrapositive. Again, it just gives you a statement. So notice how those are two statements that are true. This is just one of the true statements. That's a good dead giveaway that you can only apply that rule of contrapositive. So it's like, again, if not this part, then not this part. This is a true statement. If I like the poem, then Lena prefers black to red. I liked the poem. Well, then Lena has to prefer black to red. That's that rule 2 or that law of detachment. Now, this isn't actually a new example, so something we can see. Again, if the dress is on sale, then geometry is Tom's favorite subject. Well, geometry is Tom's favorite subject. Do you see how they match? Then the television is broken. So basically, we can say the dress is on sale, then the television is in fact broken. And that would be my true statement using Rule 3 or that law of syllogism.